Hello, I'm George Brown, and I want to welcome you to another in our series on the Armchair Traveler. Earlier this year, I got to thinking about monuments. As I travel around the world, I'm sure you have as well, we go to see a lot of historic monuments. And this has been a year, at least in my part of the country, in the southern US, where the question of which monument should be left up and which should be taken down has become quite an issue, particularly as relates to the monuments related to the American Civil War. But it's not just here. I can remember traveling in the Soviet Union in the 80s and all the statues of Lenin. And then when I went back in the 90s, they were torn down. And so it kind of raised a question, okay, what is it that makes a monument enduring? Are there, in fact, enduring monuments? And I came across a book on the Eiffel Tower. It's called Eiffel's Tower by Jill Jones. It's quite a good book about the everything related to the background and of the creation of the Eiffel Tower. And so I got this and I read it because here's a monument, Eiffel Tower, that seems in fact to be quite enduring. And I wanted to try to figure out why that was. But it's interesting, armchair traveling can take you in directions that you're not expected. And as I got into this, I learned that there was an interesting connection with the Statue of Liberty. So that got me interested in the Statue of Liberty. Is that an enduring monument? What makes that enduring? And I found another book called Enlightening the World, the story of the Statue of Liberty. I'll send you the link on this. This is Yasmin Khan, the author, Enlightening the World. And that was an even better book, actually. So I got very interested in these two monuments that I've been to. And any of us who are travelers, many have been to France, probably most have been to New York, and we've traveled and we've seen the Statue of Liberty and Eiffel Tower. But do we know the background? So I thought it might be good to reflect a little bit on what makes monuments enduring, and in particularly these two monuments, Eiffel's Tower and the Statue of Liberty. Now this is today, as I'm doing this presentation, is election day in the United States. So I thought maybe with the emphasis on Statue of Liberty, we make this kind of an election day special. Now, let me say that I'm as partisan as they come. I get involved in partisan politics like many Americans. But I got to thinking maybe by focusing on these monuments and what makes them lasting, we could elevate the conversation, at least for a few minutes, and see if there's an element of patriotism that might be a big enough umbrella to include all of us under it. So let's take a look first at Eiffel Tower, although it came later, but I want to focus more on the Statue of Liberty. So we'll start with the Eiffel Tower. So here they are, the two big monuments, and the question for the day is what makes them enduring monuments? And part of the answer to that comes by looking at the background on them. Now, the Eiffel Tower was built by Gustave Eiffel. It's interesting that it has his name. It's not the Paris Tower. It's the Eiffel Tower. And I think that comes in part for several reasons. Eiffel was the one who designed and built it, but actually he owned it for the first couple of years, and then it became property of Paris, although he continued to get the revenue from it. But perhaps more importantly, it bears his name because people, when he built it, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it would be universally liked. Probably some people called it Eiffel's Folly at the time. And so it got his name, and the name stuck, Eiffel's Tower, because in fact, he designed it and he was the one that made it happen. It was designed to be the gateway entrance to the great 1889 Paris Exposition, which was celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution. And they put out bids for towers. They wanted a very globally attractive tower in terms of its prominence. And Eiffel came up with a model that would be 300 meters, about 1,000 feet tall, that would dwarf any other structure that had been built to date. The construction itself was amazing. 18,000 metal parts had to be assembled, millions of rivets to put it together, and it was constructed from the ground up in about a 2-year time. Now, Eiffel not only designed it and oversaw the construction, but also had to deal with all the political and economic issues related to a project of this magnitude. Here's a brochure, really, of the expedition, the Universal Exposition, 1889 in Paris, showing the Eiffel Tower as one of the main prominent features of that exposition. It was a gateway to the World Exposition, seen here in an early photograph. It was the world's tallest structure, still Paris's tallest. At the time, the Washington Monument, which taken a long time to complete, was finally completed in the early 1880s, I believe. You can see here, it was the tallest structure to date. And the Eiffel Tower almost double the size of it. You see here the Eiffel Tower today. I was there with my children while Jill was with us. She didn't go up, but the others of us went up. Maybe that's about 15 years ago. And it's a great attraction in Paris, but it's a world attraction. It is one of the world's most visited structures, monuments in the world. And you can see here from the ground all the way up to the summit that you can go by elevator. It's still an amazing sight. Anytime I fly to Paris, I'm looking out the window to see if I can see the Eiffel Tower. It's amazing how it does dominate the structure. But Eiffel himself saw it not just as an engineering feat, but also as an artistic one. Here's what he said about it. He said, "I believe the tower will have its own beauty. The first principle of architectural beauty is that the essential lines of a construction be determined by a perfect appropriateness to its use. What was the main obstacle I had to overcome in designing the tower? Its resistance to wind. And I submit that the curves of the four piers as produced by our calculation, rising from an enormous base and narrowing up to the top, will give a great impression of strength and beauty." So I think it's an enduring monument. It's a monument to human innovation and progress of the late 19th century, but also a way that technology can also be artistically pleasing as well. It's a world icon. 7 million visitors a year visit the Eiffel Tower. And I would say for the complete story, I go to this book, Eiffel Tower, by Jill Jones. Now, the rest of the presentation, I'd really like to focus on another enduring monument, the Statue of Liberty. And this is one that I was led to from the book on Eiffel Tower, because what I didn't know until I read that book was a very strong connection between the two. Now, the story of the Eiffel Tower really begins with the story of Franco-American friendship. Thinking back to your early American history, you remember that the American War for Independence benefited greatly from the participation by the French, particularly Marquis de Lafayette. The picture of Lafayette on the left and a picture of Lafayette in Washington at Valley Forge on the right. So Lafayette was one of the heroes of the American Revolution. I remember at the time that the US was fighting Britain. They fought Britain again in 1812. And so France really was the ally that America looked to in those early years from Europe. It wasn't just the general, there were intellectual ties as well. So you see on the left the book, The Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu. So Montesquieu was a French philosopher who wrote about government structure. And the founding fathers, when they got to designing the Constitution, drew heavily on Montesquieu's ideas of separation of powers. So we kind of take for granted the idea that you separate judicial, executive, and legislative branches. But this was really conceived of by Montesquieu, and the founding fathers knew his work and really drew on it extensively. On the other side, the French were very interested in democracy, how it was being implemented in the United States. And there's really a French journalist, we would call him, Alex de Tocqueville, came to the United States in the early part of the 19th century and wrote a treatise on democracy in America that's still used to provide an interpretation of the early American Republic. This became very popular both in the United States but also in France, giving the United States very high prominence in the eyes of French intellectuals as a place where democracy was really being implemented. In France, there had been the revolution, but that had been followed by the Napoleon Empire and the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty. And so America was seen as where democracy really was getting a chance to flourish. The one thing that they were concerned about was slavery, because America held on to slavery much longer than the Europeans did, and it was really seen as a blight on the American democratic experience. So there was a great rejoicing, really, with the victory over slavery that was seen as critical to them with the American Civil War. So they were great fans of Lincoln and were very distraught when he was assassinated shortly after the end of the war. But the friendship with France continued long past that. You may remember that General Pershing, seen here on the left, when he led the American Expeditionary Force to World War I, to France, to the trenches in France in 1917. Here's a picture of him arriving with the French. When he got there, he said, "Lafayette, we are here." At least that's what he's reported to have said. Kind of that we are returning. You came and helped us, and now we're here to help you. Atlanta, you may not know, has its own French friendship connection. In 1962, there was a chartered plane of really art lovers, Atlanta's prominent community of art lovers who were in France. Their plane crashed at Orly Airfield when it was returning, and more than 100 people were killed in that crash. And years later, the French government arranged for the donation of a Rodin sculpture, which you can see at the High Museum today. I'm familiar with this because my wife Jill's father was the honorary French consul at the time, and he helped arrange to make sure that that statue was given. But it was given as an act of friendship between the French people and the Americans. Now, the relationship has not always been friendly. You may remember, it was kind of a silly but also sad commentary. At the time of the Iraq War, France was not in favor of the Iraq War, and the French became unpopular with a certain segment in this country. So you see here a menu where they changed from French fries to freedom fries. And then here's a poster that went along with that. I want you to boycott France. You may have remembered that people were boycotting French wines and things like that. But getting back to our story, getting back to 1865, the French intellectuals were pleased with the fact that the war had ended favorably for the North, for Abraham Lincoln's side, distraught that Lincoln was killed. And one French intellectual in particular was following this, Edward Laboulaye. He was a scholar in France, part of the aristocracy perhaps, but he had written a multi-volume treatise on America for the French, emphasizing the fact that the Americans were carrying forward the idea of freedom and democracy. He never visited the United States, but he was very interested. And in the summer of 1865, just several months after Lincoln's death, he had a dinner party at his home, and a number of other intellectuals there, and he proposed the idea that France should build a monument as a gift to the United States, honoring the achievements the United States was making in the area of freedom, democracy, and liberty. And so he proposes this monument that would be developed as a gift from France to the United States. Now, the idea was slow in developing. Remember, this is 1865. But one of the people at that dinner was Auguste Bartholdi, who was a prominent sculptor at the time. You see here a picture of him, but also some of the statues that he had been commissioned to develop in earlier years. So he was a prominent sculptor. He became very interested in the project, worked with Laboulaye, and would end up being the sculptor who would design and ultimately supervise the building of what we know as the Statue of Liberty. So Laboulaye really had the inspiration for the project. Bartholdi was the one who would actually develop it in the coming years. Now, he wanted something grand. The idea was that this would not be a normal statue or monument, but would be something that would be tremendous both in size, but also in impact. And the intellectuals in that era were very familiar with what they referred to as the seven wonders of the ancient world, One of these was the ancient Colossus of Rhodes. Here too, Colossus of Rhodes was a huge statue back in antiquity. It was torn down, so we don't have any pictures of the actual one, but from the writings and the legends, it was a huge statue. One rendering of it was that it was so large that ships could go between the legs. Here's another rendering of what people thought it might be. You see it here with these rays along the headdress here. The size is immense. So Bartoli wanted to construct something that would have the impact in reality that the Colossus of Rhodes had in mythology. Now, he drew on classical and contemporary motifs for the idea of liberty. So liberty in classical Greek and Roman sculpture, but this was carried forward to the 19th century, was conveyed as a female character. Here's a medallion that reflects the symbol, the seal of the French Second Republic. So you see here liberty, the traditional classical vision of a female character. In some cases, liberty is holding a sword in one hand and an olive branch in the other. But here, liberty is holding the laws, the scrolls which symbolizes the law. And you'll see on the headdress really is the rays of the sun around the top. So you begin to see here that what ended up in the statue was drawn from what Bartoli knew from his experience in latter 19th century Europe, France in particular. But take a look at this and you can see, I think, the connection that eventually would emerge with the Statue of Liberty. Now, in 1871, he had a chance to visit the United States, and this became critical in the development of the Statue of Liberty. One of the questions he had was obviously, well, if we're going to do this big statue and give it to America, where would it be positioned? We're going to give it as a gift, but we want to make sure it goes to a good place. And he found this island, or learned about this island. We call it Liberty Island, New York Harbor. It was called Bedloe's Island. It's interesting. A small island, New York Harbor, had been used earlier as a fort, but had been abandoned as a fort, but still was owned by the federal government. So he actually met with President Grant, 1871, and asked for the possibility that the statue, when it was given as a gift, would be placed on this island. Grant was favorably disposed to it, and as it turns out, one of the last acts that he did as president before he left office in early 1877 was to sign a proclamation designating this to be the location of the statue that would be received as a gift from France. He also, as Bartoli traveled around the US, got more ideas for the design of it. Now remember, the original impetus for this was the ending of slavery, the end of the Civil War. And there was a picture that was pretty famous at the time of Lincoln. You see here the portrait of Lincoln as a young man, and then there's just the foot of a statue. This is a statue which might have been a Liberty statue, and you see the broken chain symbolizing freedom and independence, and in this case, the end of slavery. So some of the design features that we see in the completed work of the Statue of Liberty came from this trip that Bartoli made to the United States, as well as other ideas that he had already developed. Part of it was the torch, and the torch, the idea here was this is a torch of enlightenment, the symbol of enlightenment. Now, as appropriate, this is going to be in a harbor, so it would be like a lighthouse as well. But it was a torch of enlightenment that she was holding, that she would be holding high, not a sword, because this is a monument to liberty and peace, not a militaristic statue. Holding in her hand, and it's again a drawn from classical works, was the law. But it's very interesting to me that what the inscription on the law is July 4th, 1776. So the law that was being captured here in the Statue of Liberty was not the American Constitution, which is our fundamental law, but was the Declaration of Independence. because Bartholdi and La Bouillier and others saw the Declaration of Independence as really providing the universal appeal to liberty and freedom. Here's the head with the 7 rays. Now these are thought to represent the 7 seas, the 7 continents, the face, a strong face. The speculation maybe it was his mother was the model, but it's a rather not stern, but very firm kind of presentation. 2 other elements that I had not been aware of. So you have on the foot of the Statue of Liberty the broken chain. It's very important because this brings forward the idea of liberty from slavery. The other is that the other foot is raised, which means that the Statue of Liberty is in motion, moving forward. Again, given the idea that liberty is an idea that's moving forward. It's not static, but rather it's moving forward. Now, from all of this, he goes back to France, and by 1875 completes the design. And the design then is approved by La Bouillier, and a name is given to it: Liberty Enlightening the World. Liberty Enlightening the World. So whereas for Eiffel's Tower, that name hasn't changed. It was called Eiffel's Tower, somewhat derogatorily maybe at the beginning under construction, but it became and still is Eiffel's Tower. Statue of Liberty's first name that was given by the designer and the sponsor was Liberty Enlightening the World. You see here the rendition of it that was used for the patent that he had for the Statue of Liberty, because he could use in this image, he would sell it and make some money off of the image itself. But so this is a final image. But let's take a look at now. So you start with the 2 important people to start with, La Bouillier and Bartholdi, the man who conceived and kind of sponsored the idea in France, the designer, but then 2 other men. And here's where our friend Gustave Eiffel comes back in. He was after kind of Bartholdi was going to use a technique of a copper-clad sculpture, but how would it be held up? You'll see in a minute that Eiffel gave the answer to that. And the other man is American architect Richard Hunt. In our part of the country, we know about him because he was architect for Biltmore up in Asheville. But these 2 men then were very much involved in the project as it moved forward. I'm going to show you a bit of a video on this.
We're on Liberty Island in the middle of New York Harbor, standing at the feet of the Statue of Liberty.
Today, people think of Manhattan's towering skyline, but in 1886, when she made her first appearance here, there was nothing as tall as Lady Liberty with her torch held high.
The statue was a gift from the Republic of France to the United States in honor of the friendship between the 2 countries, but also in recognition of both countries' commitment to democracy. The idea of this gift, of this massive sculpture, had originated with a Frenchman who was a historian of American history, and he was a Republican even at the end of the reign of Napoleon III.
He was also the president of the French Anti-Slavery League, and so a symbol that represented a nation that valued liberty and freedom and had ended slavery was something that La Bouillier saw as a way forward for France. The United States was a model. This is the biggest statue the United States has, this structure, which probably most people would assume was financed by a state because it's so big. Was not. The whole point was that this was financed by the people of France and then by the people of America. And so the French set out to raise 400,000 francs for the statue, while the United States citizens were meant to raise the money, about $250,000, to pay for the base.
Much of the base was supported by members of the Union League Club. but they came up about $100,000 short. By this time, the sculpture had been completed and was laying in pieces in France, waiting for the pedestal to be completed. At that point, Joseph Pulitzer, the owner of a newspaper called The World, reached out to his readership and put forward this project as an expression not of New York's elites, but of the common man.
Pulitzer was the master of PR. He raised $100,000 in less than 6 months, and most of those donations were less than $1. And that tells you a lot about how Americans, many of whom would have been immigrants, felt about their ideals and ideologies.
So how does one take an abstract idea and represent it physically? Bartholdi was the sculptor and is responsible for not only selecting the site, but also for the overall artistic vision. Richard Morris Hunt was hired to produce the pedestal, and he draws on ancient architectural vocabulary.
He references what was one of the most well-known monuments from antiquity, the Pharos, or lighthouse of Alexandria in Egypt, which was this Greek city originally, but incorporated many aspects of both Greek and Egyptian architecture. And we can really see that in this building.
The pedestal was praised in its own day for having a strong design in its own right, but also not being so grand as to overshadow the sculpture above it.
They really work very well together. This is a local Connecticut granite. It's rusticated. There are galleries on each side that have a colonnade that you can go inside that have spectacular views of the harbor.
I love the gently domed rondels that surround the lower part of the pediment. There are 40 of them, and that was one for each state back in 1886.
It's a reminder of the 100th year anniversary of the United States, so it's a symbolic building in that way as well.
And similarly, on the sculpture itself, the rays of the crown are 7, a reference to the 7 seas and the 7 continents, and the idea of liberty spreading across the world.
When this was dedicated, 1 million people reportedly came out to see it. So what did that 1 million people and the immigrants, when they sailed through the Narrows, what did they see?
They saw a personification of an idea. They saw a figure informed by the great tradition of ancient Greece, the inventors of the ideals of democracy. The figure is heavily draped so that her body is almost completely lost below it. We can see a finer undergarment and then big, broad fields of copper cladding.
Our eyes are drawn up to her face, to the torch. What is also remarkable is her tablet. It just says very simply, July 4th, 1776 in Roman numerals.
But those symbols, the symbol of the draped woman holding a torch, this can be read in multiple ways. And Bartholdi was at pains to express that this was not an incendiary torch, but rather this was a torch of enlightenment. And what a face. Her look is so determined, it's stoic, it is unwavering.
She looks like she has accepted that this is her duty. She needs to show the world what the ideals of liberty really mean.
And she gently strides forward, matching the task at hand, as if she's going to bring liberty from the United States to the rest of the world. And in fact, this was produced just as France was moving to the Third Republic. It's windy out here as we stand at the foot of the statue, and it's a reminder of the engineering brilliance that went into the design of this sculpture. This is made out of very thin sheets of copper that have to withstand enormous pressure from high winds, even hurricanes.
It is made of repoussé work.
That means that it was hammered from the back, in this case, in pieces against wooden molds.
But then you have another problem. If you figured out how to build it, how does it stay up?
And so the credit here really has to go to Gustave Eiffel, the designer and owner of the Eiffel Tower in Paris.
His other masterpiece is right here in Manhattan's harbor.
But it's hidden underneath Bartholdi's beautiful copper skin. Within is a brilliant mechanism to hold every single sheet of copper independently.
There are 4 big, thick steel pylons, and coming off of there is the spider web of steel connecting to every single piece. This intricate design that is incredibly light.
And none of those steel posts can touch the copper, because if they did, it would set up a kind of galvanic electric current that would corrode the sculpture. So each post has to be insulated from the copper itself. So the Statue of Liberty, which we credit to Bartholdi, is actually very much a communal work. It's a work of 2 nations, but it's also the work of the brilliant architect of the pedestal and an equally brilliant engineer.
Many different people working together to achieve a remarkable result.
So you have that, shows you just a little bit of construction and the role that Eiffel played in it. So you start with the 21-year process. It was commissioned in October 28th, 1886, 21 years after the La Bollier told his friends of the idea of doing that. And it's associated with liberty, with the end of slavery, with America's role as enlightening the world through liberty. But today we also have another element that we think of with the Statue of Liberty, and that has to do with welcoming the world. And for this, so far we've talked about 4 men that were involved in it, and this one we turn to a woman. Emma Lazarus, you probably know her story. Young Jewish woman in New York City, from a rather well-to-do Jewish family that had immigrated earlier. She was a native here, but she was a fairly well-known poet and writer at the time. She had become involved with helping to support the refugees that were beginning to come from Eastern Europe because of the anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe at the time. And she was devastated by what she learned then, the squalor of the people, what they were fleeing. And so she had this interest in refugees coming to America. As the video showed, that in the US, they were trying to raise some money for it. And one of the fundraisers that they did was to auction different artistic pieces. And she was asked to write a poem. First she said no, but then she agreed to do it. And she wrote a poem that has become quite famous, and it's very much associated with the Statue of Liberty and what it symbolizes today. And that's the beacon to the world. This was not so much the main idea of the Liberty statue when it was created, but it became so. You see here this plaque that is now at the base of the statue itself. It was added 20, 30 years later. The entire short poem that she wrote called the New Colossus. Now, these are words that are very familiar. The end of the poem, it's not a long poem, but we know just the last lines of it. And this really added a new dimension to the Statue of Liberty. A couple of things related to the poem. It's interesting, I think, that you see the statue here is looking outward from Washington, from New York. So it's not inward looking, it's outward looking, beckoning the world with the torch that's the enlightenment of liberty. And then you see here the harbor with the 2 sides of the Hudson River, the Twin Cities. She refers to them in the poem. And as I said earlier, the building of the statue was equated with the Colossus of Rhodes, so this great statue of antiquity. And that's where really the name for the poem comes from, the New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air bridge harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So this is what I think when we think of the Statue of Liberty today as an enduring monument, we think of it probably more as the beacon for immigration, a symbol of Americans' openness to the world. But really it's enduring, I think, because it's based not on a person. It's not a monument to a person, but to an idea, to an ideal. And that's liberty, freedom, justice, democracy. Those words maybe are enduring, but they have a changed meaning over time. So it's up to us, I think, from generation to generation, to really determine what it is for us. How is it that we are able to see the Statue of Liberty as liberty enlightening the world? And so the Statue of Liberty, I think, what I come away with is a number of things. First, we need to remember it was a gift. It was a gift from the people of France to the people of America. America as a country is not big on humility, and it's good to have, I think, a sense of humility. That this was our enduring monument, the most prominent of all our monuments, was a gift from another country. We need to recognize that liberty is still a work in progress. So yes, the chains of slavery, in a narrow sense, were broken in 1865, but we're very aware today that the chains of racism have not been obliterated by any means. And so the liberty is a work in progress. And we also have to recognize that we continue to look for how to be welcoming to the world. Shortly after at the time of the Statue of Liberty, the U.S. was fairly open, but in 1924, very restrictive immigration laws were passed. They kept really non-Europeans out. It's interesting, 1965, President Johnson signed in the new immigration law that really opened up immigration for our generation. He signed that law at the Statue of Liberty. And so it's very symbolic in that regard. So on this election day, I think maybe we can think of the Statue of Liberty as being an enduring monument because it represents what our country at its best can represent.